Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and today I want to review the new Marvel animated show called What If, which basically shows us different scenarios of how things might have went if things happened differently. And I think the idea of this show is actually really fun. It has a lot of potential to show us a lot of interesting stuff that we would want to see, to play around with a lot of fun stuff. So I love the setup of the show, and I love that character of the Watcher who's in the intro. He's basically examining different timelines and all of that. It's all done in a very fun way, I think. So the potential is there for an amazing show that can play around with the whole MCU universe and showing us a lot of fun scenarios and pitting different characters against each other, which otherwise we will never get to see them meet or fight or cooperate or whatever. So it has a lot of potential for a lot of fun stuff and play with any character they want from the entire MCU. And so the potential is there for something amazing, and I do think some of the episodes were really good, some of them were not so good. So let's begin. The first episode was What If Captain Carter was the first Avenger. Basically, she's the one who gets the super soldier serum, she's the one who becomes Captain America basically, while Steve Rogers remains in his original body. He's also crippled by a bullet, and so he basically becomes the first Iron Man because Stark's father builds the first Iron Man suit, and Steve is the one who pilots it. And so this was maybe the weakest episode, I think, in the show so far, because first of all, logically it makes no sense that Stark's father already invents the Iron Man suit back in the 40s, so already he has the technology to make it. It's hard to accept. Of course, it's Tony Stark's father, who also was a scientist, also a brilliant mind, and all of that. That's fine, but still, practically, the technology would be there for such a suit to work already decades before Tony Stark invented it. That's kind of lame, and it also takes away Tony Stark's achievement. So what, do they reveal that his father is actually the one who invented the technology and he just hid it away and he simply inherited it later? Or what? So it doesn't make sense. Of course, they kind of explain it of him using the Tesseract as a power source. Okay, that can explain away the energy issue, the power source of the suit. Instead of Tony Stark's arc reactor, so now they use the Infinity Stone as the power source. Fine, but still, the technology of the suit itself already being that advanced, and how does a power source make it impenetrable, as they said? And so a lot of things in the episode just doesn't make any sense. And Agent Carter was actually an awesome character that I really liked in the movie, and she had her own show, which I also kind of liked her in it. I love the actress, I love the character, and so I don't mind the idea of this episode, but they show that she's a much better Captain America than Steve Rogers ever was and all of that. And so they have all these over exaggerations which I didn't like, and it's a cartoon, so they are allowed to do things more silly or more exaggerated in a cartoon. But the way they made this episode, it had all these woke elements, all these generals telling her, oh, you cannot do this, you cannot do that because you're a woman. Why would the general be so stupid? If she got the superpowers, if she's that strong, why not use her just because she's a woman? It was just too stupid, even for the time period, and so it makes no sense. And so I didn't like that episode that much. And the second episode was also a little bit annoying with the whole idea of T'Challa becoming Star-Lord instead of Peter Quill. Didn't the name Star-Lord come from the fact that Peter Quill's mother called him that even when he was a kid back on Earth, and so that's why he was calling himself that? So why the hell would people be calling T'Challa that just because he got taken to space instead of him? And of course he becomes a much better Star-Lord than Peter Quill ever was. Peter Quill is just some loser wiping floor on Earth in this episode. And T'Challa, meanwhile, is basically Space Jesus. He basically solved all the galaxy's problems all by himself. So it was a little bit annoying as well, the way it kind of diminishes the character of Peter Quill, who I think was a very likable character, because he was human, because he was not perfect and with weaknesses, and all of that was what made him a fun character, because he was trying to be great, he was trying to be famous, and he failed at it because he's not perfect. And now they replace him with someone who's basically Space Jesus, who's good at everything, who's the best at everything, and he is famous, the whole galaxy loves him, he saved the whole galaxy, he's perfect, he can do it all, he's basically a Gary Stu. The same problem as the Mary Sue with Captain Carter in the first episode. Now it's a Gary Stu with this character of T'Challa, who he didn't have anything to do with the whole Guardians of the Galaxy stuff, and now suddenly he's in the place of Star-Lord, and he's still talking with the Wakanda accent, even though it makes little sense. If he was kidnapped at such an early age and basically lived in the whole galaxy, why would he still speak at exactly the same kind of accent if he lived most of his life out in space? So that made no sense. And the whole part with Thanos showing up and being good only because Star-Lord convinced him to be good, that his evil plan of genocide doesn't make sense, and Thanos agreed, and so he's a good guy now. That part I have mixed feelings about, because on the one hand, I always said, why didn't people simply convince him that his plan made no sense, which it didn't, because once he gained all the Infinity Stone and became basically godlike, he has godlike powers. Why not simply feed anyone who needs feeding? Why simply not organize a way of unlimited food supply or whatever? Simply create, you don't even have to do it yourself with your magic power. Simply create the agriculture or whatever is needed to feed everyone. There's enough space, there's enough planets that you can terraform and whatever, so you can actually organize unlimited food supplies. And so his whole motivation of wiping out half the universe never really made much sense. When he has that kind of power, why use it to simply wipe out half of life? And also it would be a temporal solution anyway, because after that, after he destroys the stones, he can never do it again. And so what prevents the same problem from coming back later? So he didn't really solve anything. So that's something that always annoyed me with the Thanos character, even though I think he was a very fun villain, because they show that he's not just evil, that he has what he thinks is a plan for the greater good and all of that. I love that element of it. I love the fact that he was not straight up evil, that he had some complexity to him. That was something fun in that character, but the plan itself was still stupid. And so part of me kind of enjoys the fact that they addressed it here, that they said, you know, your plan was stupid, and I just talked with you, I explained to you that it's stupid, and suddenly Thanos is now a good guy. So that's something I both like and dislike, because on the one hand it addressed that problem, on the other hand it doesn't really explain why he was so stupid in the original timeline anyway. Why didn't he understand that earlier? So maybe they should have explained his evil plan better, like what exactly was he thinking back then, and what exactly was said to him that convinced him. It also makes all the Avengers look stupid now, because why didn't they simply talk with him instead of fighting him? If he was capable of being convinced, why no one else tried to convince him? How come they didn't do it in the movies? How come in the movies they were just fighting him? So they were stupid to fight him, because they could have talked with him and explained things to him, and suddenly he would have been a good guy. It's also funny how in this episode he basically became totally a wimp, much weaker than he was. You know, even without the Infinity Stones, he was one of the strongest beings in the galaxy and all of that. And yet, in this episode of the cartoon, because it turned good, suddenly he cannot stand his ground in a fight. Suddenly he's a total wimp compared to how he was in the movies. So I didn't like that. That kind of diminishes him as a villain now. It makes him look stupid and weak and just pathetic. So I'm not sure I like it in this episode, even though it was fun to see all these characters playing in different scenarios in an interesting way. So I liked part of it, but still a lot of things in it annoyed me and made no sense, and it kind of even ruins the previous movies, which were good overall. I enjoyed the Marvel movies, but they always had a lot of silly and illogical things, and some stuff in this episode just kind of highlights that. It just makes it look even stupider now. And the third episode I thought was much better, much more interesting. It had, once again, characters from all over the MCU. I love the fact how they brought back the second Hulk movie back into the continuity, because, you know, it was supposed to be part of the same continuity with the Avengers, but they replaced the actor of the Hulk, and so it was a little bit of a problem, so it was kind of ignored. And yet here it's a cartoon, so you don't really notice it if it's a different actor. So they basically brought that movie back into the same continuity, so I like that. There was a lot of good attention to detail, the way they tied all the different movies together. They had the elements from all of them tied together in an interesting way. And the only problem is that, once again, they showed that someone was actually capable of something much greater than we thought. And so if he was capable of that, why didn't they do it in the movies? And so a lot of things like that they kind of highlight some of the missed opportunities in the movies themselves that came before. So it shows the problems in the movies, that they have so many characters with so many interesting abilities, and yet they never really fully use them in the movies. And so at least in the cartoon they kind of showed what could happen if you do this and that, so that was interesting. But also it was a missed opportunity, because they didn't show what happened next. They basically show that someone killed all the Avengers basically, But what I would like to see is what would happen next in this timeline. Like, if all the Avengers are dead, what would happen when Thanos invades? What would happen with Hydra? Like, what would happen next? Like, I would want to see that. And the stuff with Hydra, especially, it always kind of bugged me the way that Hydra tried to kill the Avengers, they tried to take over. But what would they do? What would they say if they succeed? But then later Thanos tries to wipe out half of humanity. Would they just let it happen? Would they not fight him? And if they do want to fight him, wouldn't they regret killing off the Avengers that could have helped them, and so on? So I actually wouldn't mind seeing those scenarios. I would have liked to see, some of the villains, like what if they actually succeeded? Would they later regret their decision because they would realize they were stupid or what? So I actually would like to see that more, but just like Thanos became a nice guy in the second episode, that was kind of interesting, even though it's kind of problematic and they didn't really explore it well. Like, I would have wanted to see the conversation when he was convinced. Like, I think that would have been interesting, not just mention that, not just as a side note, but to actually see that conversation itself would have been interesting. So the same thing here. I think it's interesting to see the aftermath of these different scenarios. Like, okay, all the Avengers got killed, so what would happen next? So I wish the episode would have showed that, but they didn't. So it's not as interesting as it could have been. Maybe later episodes would explore those questions as well, and then that would be interesting. And the best episode so far, I think, was the fourth episode about Doctor Strange. This by far is much superior to all the other episodes. This was actually interesting. In some ways, even better than the original Doctor Strange movie, which I really like. I really love that movie, but it had some flaws, it had some missed opportunities. For example, the whole love story subplot in the movie was not really necessary in the movie. It didn't really go anywhere. It was basically just a side note, just filler in that movie. It wasn't really a big part of the story or the character. However, in this cartoon, they made it a big part of the story. They basically showed a timeline in which Doctor Strange's love interest gets killed, and that's his motivation of becoming the master of the mystic arts later on. So this was actually a big part of the character and the story in this episode, and part of me wishes they would have done that in the actual movie. It's also a bit of a problem because if it's basically a different timeline, and different timelines exist, then why did this episode show as if there are certain events that cannot be changed no matter what? It makes no sense, since we have seen another timeline in which she lived, in which she never died, and yet this episode, according to this episode, the only reason he ever became the sorcerer is because she died. That's what gave him the motivation to pursue the magic arts and all of that, because he wanted to bring her back. And yet in the movie, the reason was because he lost the use of his hands, and so he wanted to cure himself, and that was the motivation. And the whole love story was just kind of a sideline that was not important to the story. So part of me actually prefers this version of the story, but it doesn't fit together. So if this is all set in different timelines, different versions of the same events of the same characters, then I kind of expected them to tie back to the movie in the end, and yet they didn't. It was kind of a completely separate universe in the end. But part of me wishes maybe they should have tied it together to the movie and end it with the timeline of the movie, meaning that in the end he would have change things to make it about himself, so that she will live. That will be the way to save her, that he will sacrifice himself, in a sense, that he will damage himself, so that that will become his motivation instead of trying to save her. And the whole thing with him trying to come back in time to try to save her, and yet she keeps getting killed off in different ways every time he does it, like it's an event that he's unable to change. That seems to be taken straight out of the movie The Time Machine 2002, which used the exact same idea of him inventing the time machine to try to save her, and yet every time he goes back in time to try to save her, she still dies in a different way every single time, so he's unable to save her despite having a time machine. And in the end of the movie they explain that it's because it basically prevents a paradox, because if he did save her, then he would have no reason to invent the time machine in the first place, and then he would be unable to come back and save her. And so her dying is a fixed point, because otherwise it will be a paradox, and that's why the universe itself basically keeps killing her, because otherwise it will be illogical. And so that's something that I actually really liked in that movie, and I feel like this episode of What If basically borrowed that exact same idea and did it again in their own version, almost point to point. The only thing missing is him saying, I could go back 1,000 times and see her die in 1,000 different ways and yet cannot save her. So it felt a little bit too similar, almost in a copyright illegal way, but it is a very fun and interesting idea, and they played with it well, and they did it well, and it's also, good drama and good emotions. interesting character interactions and all of that. So that was very fun in this episode. And then they had the whole idea of him trying to get more power to be able to do it, to basically defeat time, defeat the universe, and to save her anyway. And so he becomes obsessed with it, and so he becomes more and more kind of power hungry. He tries to become more powerful by observing the powers of different entities that he conjures up from different dimensions and whatever. And we see the same tentacle creature, which we also saw in the first episode, which I think isn't that the symbol of Hydra, like the tentacle creature? I think in one of the TV shows, I think it was Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., they also show the tentacle creature which Hydra is worshipping and all of that. So I guess it's also nice how they're tying it all together, but they never explained it. What is that tentacle creature exactly? So anyway, so Doctor Strange observes this creature as well as many others, and it becomes part of him, and he becomes like a monster, he becomes evil, and that's also an element, it's an idea I also always enjoy seeing. I love this when it's done well, to see a character that is having good intentions, but falling into the dark side and all of that. So that part of it also was done very well in this episode. Even the animation itself was really nice. It was really visually artistic and all of that. So I really love that element of it. And then we have two Doctor Stranges from two times. The only thing missing is that I wish they would have somehow tied it to the original movie in the end. That maybe in the end he would have realized that the only way to save her was to sacrifice himself, to make himself suffer instead of her, and that way she will live, and that will give him the motivation to become a sorcerer anyway, without her dying. And then that would fit perfectly into the original movie. It would explain that what happened in the original movie was actually caused by him from another timeline. And they did show, they focused a few times on some car that caused the accident, and so I kept wondering who was driving that car, like who is the one who caused the accident. Wouldn't it have been cool to show that maybe it was Doctor Strange from another reality, that maybe he caused his own accident because he wanted himself to get injured, and that he's the one who caused his own accident to preserve the proper timeline and to save her life while causing harm to himself, to give himself the motivation to become the sorcerer that we saw in the original Doctor Strange movie. So that was kind of the only thing I thought could have been more interesting, and it would have tied things better. And instead they went with a totally dark ending of the whole universe being destroyed and all of that. And I did like the part with the Watcher, when Doctor Strange becomes aware of the Watcher that we see in the intro of every episode, the narrator of the show. I did love the fact that he kind of became a part of the story a little bit, but maybe it would have been better if he actually did intervene and he kind of led everything to the original movie, and it would have explained the original movie why wasn't the love story so pivotal in that movie as it was here. And so I think there was a little bit of a missed opportunity, but still a very fun episode, the best one so far, I think, in my opinion. And as for episode 5, I only have one thing to say, bear with me: zombies. That's basically it. There is no real interesting story there, and the whole idea of it is kind of ridiculous. The only thing I did like is the action scenes, which were kind of cool. The way they showed that the former Avengers who became zombies still have their powers, still have their special abilities, and still use them, even though they're brainless zombies. So some of that was kind of fun, the way they played with all of that, but still the basic story and idea is kind of ridiculous. So I'm not sure how much I like it story-wise, but it was kind of fun. Visually, some of the action scenes were cool and all of that, so it was still entertaining. So I would say this was an average episode. It wasn't as good as episode 4 or 3, but it was probably better than episode 1 and 2. So that's my opinion on the show so far. Let me know what you think, and we can discuss all of this in the comments below. And I will see you all next time. Bye bye.